I think 2019 around 1 million were caught from the wild or something.
Wow, that is
And these are
crazy.
fish that won't breed in your home aquarium because firstly, they get to about 30 centimeters. They're social, people keep them on their own.
Welcome back to the Animals at Home podcast. My name is Dylan Perrin, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Today, I'm speaking with Rebecca Bentley, who is a Ph.D. student out of the UK. She's also the owner and the operator of the YouTube channel Freshwater Ichthyology. So she mainly focuses on fish and aquarium keeping, but especially catfish. That's what she's doing her Ph.D. on, and sort of the morphology of the various species. There's 1,000 species under that umbrella, and their diets and whatnot. And so the reason I had Rebecca on is, I know a lot of you keep fish anyway, so there's actually quite a lot of crossover between those two worlds, but it's just always fascinating to talk to someone who's coming at a keeping or captive animal keeping from a specific scientific view. And what we discuss is the fact that I often reference the aquarium hobby as being not the gold standard, but something for us reptile people to look up to as far as how well they care for their animals. And she actually had messaged me and said it's kind of the opposite in a lot of ways. There's a lot of fish people that are just kind of doing things willy-nilly. So we just discussed the variations between the two worlds, the trap that sometimes people fall into when they think that they've created an ecosystem or a bioactive enclosure and thinking that that's natural and good just because it has plants and looks good to our eye doesn't necessarily mean that it's good naturally. And she also runs through some very specific ways to extract really important scientific information to sort of avoid the myths that get built up, that folklore husbandry that gets built up in both hobbies, whether it's fish keeping or reptile keeping. She talks about how to actually extract that from or remove that entirely from your research process and get into the journals. And even if you're a person that doesn't have an access to the institutes, universities and whatnot to have access to peer-reviewed papers, she gave some really good information for how to find good information, which is so important for both hobbies. And other than that, we discuss in nuances about fish keeping in different fish species, and you can tell that Rebecca is incredibly intelligent. So it was really stretching my mind to make sure I was staying on top of things, because it's always fun to talk to someone who's so focused on something that they could really talk for hours about one specific thing. It was really fascinating. If you're looking for more information on this podcast, make sure you head to animalsathomenetwork.com. Thank you so much to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring this podcast. You can find affiliate links in both the show notes and the YouTube description. And if you would like to join us over on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/animalsathome. The proceeds from that go directly towards supporting this podcast, whether that's paying for editing, server space, the website, equipment, and so on and so on. And the support that I get from the patrons is incredible, and I do really, really appreciate it. Let's jump into this episode. Enjoy.
This is Dr. Chris Jenkins, CEO of the Orianne Society and host of the Snake Talk podcast. We are pleased to announce the launch of our new Hudson Berkshire Turtle Conservation Program. Turtles are one of the most endangered groups of animals on the planet, and the Orianne Society aims to reverse this trend by working to conserve Blandings, bog, spotted, and wood turtles in one of the most critical regions in North America. The Hudson Berkshire region of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Massachusetts is the only place in the world where all four of these turtles occur, and their populations and habitats are declining. A generous donor is helping us launch the Hudson Berkshire Turtle Conservation Program by matching the funds we raise during our Long Live the Turtles campaign. If you care about turtles or restoring wildlife habitat, please consider supporting our efforts by donating today and having your conservation investment doubled. The campaign runs until World Turtle Day on May 23rd. Learn more about our program and how you can get involved at www.orianne.org.
Rebecca, welcome to the podcast. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Well, you sent me a message a couple weeks ago, and it was just something regarding the aquarium hobby or fish keeping, and we're going to get into that. But it just kind of sparked my interest. I'm like, oh, I talk about and reference fish tanks and aquariums quite often because I'm constantly comparing reptile keeping and fish keeping. And you had this sort of more nuanced position, especially because you have a high level expertise in fish keeping, and you also dabble in reptile keeping as well. So I thought, you know what, we should have you on and have a conversation. But let's set a little bit of a foundation first. Were you always involved in fish keeping just from when you were young, or is it something that you gradually got into?
So I started fish keeping at the age of 10, and it was just first pet that I'm meant to look after, because I've had guinea pigs before, cat, rabbits for a very short period, and it was my parents said you can have a fish tank. My sister ended up having a hamster, but I don't know how. But I got the opportunity to have a fish tank, and I saw the leaflets, and my dad had fish for a short time, and I was like, I really want this individual fish. So I started off with Pistogramma cacatoides, which is a dwarf cichlid. Most people started with goldfish, guppies or live bearers or something like that, but I really wanted this dwarf cichlid, and kind of like it sort of went from there, and I was really interested in dwarf cichlids, and I still am interested in cichlids, but the discus kind of are that sort of, they're my sort of dwarf cichlid, even though they're not a dwarf cichlid, they're still a cichlid, but they replace that sort of behaviour because my tanks aren't most suited for dwarfs. And then I kind of dabbled with goldfishes, fancy goldfishes. I find their morphology, their evolution from a scientific standpoint, like the domestication, really interesting. I've kept betta and Siamese fighters, and it's all because I kind of like, I always knew I wanted to work with animals, but it's just defining what, and then finding fish really helped there.
Yeah, well, and it's one of those hobbies where there's just, it's very similar to reptile keeping, where there's an endless potential of different things you can get into, and
Yes.
there's constantly like hobbies nested inside the major hobby, nested inside another hobby.
Yes,
Like you can go all the way down to keeping snails,
Yeah, we have, I think, 5,000 plus species available for freshwater of just fish, but I think there's a lot more, because if there's something you want, usually there's some way of finding out about it. And there's so much that sticks within those hobbies, and so much changes all the time.
Yeah. I'm kind of curious. You had mentioned the domestication of goldfish. Is there something about because their wild ancestors are more like a koi, I think, or some sort of carp. You can fill us in on that. And then is there something about their wild ancestor that allowed them to be domesticated? Because that's one thing that constantly comes up in all more exotic animal keeping is, are we domesticating some of these animals, or are they basically staying as a wild type, just born in captivity? So is there something that made that species more moldable?
I'm really rusty on goldfish, but I do know, I think it's the fact that they do naturally have that, well, they can get that gold coloration. So I think they originate either from the Prussian carp or the Prussian carp. So that gold coloration really was what people valued, and they're quite easy to, I think, select traits. They're not like dog breeds, when you cross them or when you breed them, they're quite solid with it's quite easy to keep that line without getting random traits. But goldfishes, they're not as sort of stable, so you breed two telescope eyes and you might get one without the telescope eyes. It's also the fact they're not really that well studied in that sort of evolution, and it shows a sort of history element, like dogs show the history of humanity. I think goldfish also show aspects of a history, like the Chinese brought over the demikin and the wakin. I think even the ryokin to Japan, which then became quite popular in Japan, hence why they're thought of as Japanese, but they're not. And
that's the koi fish?
Shows that. Sorry?
Is that what the koi fish are? Is that the species name? Or
No, these are just goldfish.
Oh, those are goldfish.
So,
okay.
Yeah, so Japan has a massive goldfish culture. It doesn't really sort of blend in well with or at all with the koi, apart from one goldfish variety. So it does show some sort of interaction between different people, and then we've got our own variety. So in Bristol, we've got Bristol Shabunkin, which people they have a beautiful heart-shaped large tail, elongate like any shabunkin, and they do look more like that wild type, but really nice coloration. I think they're much nicer than koi. But there's also like a London shabunkin, the American sort of style, because as like with dog breeds, depending where you are, they're different in different countries. We have different standards, and you can kind of compare, and it sort of is that history. It's their evolution as because a lot of people kind of look at this style of evolution as totally like wrong, or they look down on artificial selection. And I went to this brilliant talk by a lady called Katrina Van Grauw, and she did an entire book on sort of the sort of selective breeding and the history of it, particularly aimed more at birds, I think. But it is interesting because it's almost they're under a different selection pressure, whereas we look at like aspects of diet, or I don't know, environment, temperature, anything like that, and that being the selection pressure. Whereas our selection, we put a different selection pressure on different species for different reasons. Goldfish, aesthetics mostly. Not many people really eat them, but like, and then there's other fish that might be for dietary reasons. I don't think there's as much like selection for diet, creating diversity in fish, as opposed to say cattle, horses,
Right.
not horses, but pigs and stuff like that.
Well, it is a fascinating thing like about humanity is the artificial selection of a breeding process, something that we've been taking part in for 10,000 years, and it's such a part of human nature. And especially with dog breeds, you see that where there is an aesthetic side, but there's also a working side, right? People will have working dogs, whether they're hunting dogs or whatever they are, and so those dogs get tested to make sure, okay, is this Labrador going to retrieve the duck properly, and okay, make sure you have a really good hunting dog, and then that's also going to be your breeding stock, where then you'll have other dog breeds or fish or reptiles too, where you're just going off of aesthetics and you're not necessarily making sure some genetics are solid. So you could see where there's like an ethical line where you want to make sure you're walking tightly, because you end up with weird things, right? Like, compressed bodies.
Yeah, which is why I don't keep goldfish anymore.
Okay, so was that part of you just felt wrong about it, or?
So swim bladder disorders are a massive thing with goldfish. I mostly fell into somehow keeping mostly telescope eyes, and it's just the amount of swim bladder disorders that are around. And I think personally, I'm not a vet, so I can't really say for definite, but I think especially look at one particular paper that is mostly displaced swim bladder, so that organ, which a lot of people just say treat swim bladder like it's, I don't know, like some disease. It's an organ. It's getting shifted, I think, as the fish grows, something shifting it, because I notice every time it's always shifted to one particular direction. They're always floating on their left side or their right side. And I think it's as they're growing, there's a kill switch, and it kind of seems to be getting earlier. And I brought fish from a variety of suppliers, some really highly ranked ones, and they're still getting those disorders. And I don't see any. I see fish getting deeper and deeper. So ones that were once sort of round shape, and now it's getting just long downwards. And there's no selection against it. People are wanting that, and no one's asking for any different. So I don't think there's going to be any change. And I was rescuing goldfish for a bit, because when I worked in the trade, I worked for 6 years. I'd get goldfish offered like every 2 weeks or something, so I'd take in loads. But then I moved to a flat, and I was like, oh, I can't really have the pond anymore, because I'm really into like actually keeping them naturally, because a lot of farmers do it in different countries. A lot of breeders, they keep them outside for that seasonal variation. They have that rest period where you don't feed them. They're not going to feed anyway, a bit like koi if they're kept in those colder conditions. And then in summer they're a lot more active. You start feeding them, they have better colors, especially for because I kept the telescopes. A lot of the pandas, the blacks, that needs that melanin, the sun, something about sunlight, because it could be UVB. I never tested it. I also found that LEDs did nothing for coloration. Fluorescents, I'd have to have them on a lot, but just even having them outside for 20 minutes just helped that black coloration. Because a lot of pandas would go completely white, and even the black ones will go completely white in a normal aquarium. And to be honest, that pandas are really difficult to maintain because it is that sort of managing the different colorations.
Interesting.
But
Well,
yeah, so I just stopped.
Yeah, and I could see that. I mean, it's very analogous to what we see in the reptile world too, where if you're just focused on aesthetics, you can kind of hit the ditch quickly with the genetics as far as, running into issues. And if you're only looking, especially if you're only looking at offspring, that maybe the swim bladder issue hasn't developed until an adult, and you're looking at how cool these new babies look, then those become your breeders, and then it becomes this perpetuating issue where you're never getting in front of the problem. And so that there does need to be a little bit of a test for that adult. Like, is that adult going to be able to live a long life or a healthy life before you attempt to replicate whatever you're trying to replicate aesthetically?
Yes, and the standards. So in Japan, I believe their standards shows you they look at the movement of the fish and how well it sort of swims, how muscular it is. But in the UK, I think we do have a ranch use society. So that's a Japanese goldfish without the dorsal fin, the sort of a round one. It's traditionally top view, so it's meant to be looked from above. They might still use movement, looking at the movement, how it. But a lot of it seems to be more on that aesthetic side. But I'm so far out of goldfish now. I've not kept them. Well, my liner on the ponds that I had also broke. So.
Gotcha. So then what? Eventually, you do have one snake, I think, or maybe you have more than one reptile.
Yes.
But I think one snake. What got you to keep a reptile?
So, well, I always liked hognoses, and I do like snakes. I just find them a bit more relaxing. She's not relaxing to hold at all, but she's okay to watch. She's quite interesting. But I just I've always liked having different animals, I guess, but also it's something different, like a break away from the fish. I work the fish, I study fish. So, everything is about the fish, and then it's nice to have something else. Hognoses, to be honest, the reason I liked them originally was because of the size. And then it kind of just enjoyed like the activity levels as well, which I found out more later, because originally we kept her in a rub, and with the heat mat, it wasn't heating up. She wasn't eating. But she started to eat a little bit more, and her shedding was atrocious. We bought her a bad shed anyway. And then got the bib straight away into a 4 foot, but she was 2 years old when we got her. And she's just interesting. So she's something different. I can try all different things with her. Whereas fishes, I think, is a little bit more difficult to do DIY. Different materials, you have to be a lot more careful with things. Just because it's not like a lot of like the decor isn't going to risk like causing pollution or anything. It's just something different, and I just that I've worked with snakes. I just find them a bit more relaxing.
Yeah. So you're an animal person at heart, so you can appreciate the snake. And then, can you give us a little rundown of your education? So you maybe your master's, and then what you're working on your PhD. We'll get into deeper in the weeds of your PhD later, but just give us kind of the brief overview.
So I did my master's at Imperial College of the Natural History Museum. So it's in Biosystematics. So basically evolution. I looked at taxonomy, phylogenetics, and also sort of different modelling techniques for computer modelling. A lot of morphology. So I mostly have done a lot of work with specimens, so historical specimens at the museum, looking at using their morphology to build a phylogeny, or understanding the different species there. So I did that at the museum and Imperial College. And so that was 2 projects on the Loricariidae catfishes. And then 1 project, because molecular is really difficult to get funding and it's expensive, I had to do that on corals. That wasn't my best work at all, because I don't do corals at all. They don't interest me. So then I finished that, and I've worked in the industry until then almost. I stopped halfway through my master's, working with both fish and reptiles, because you have to do both in a way. And then I signed up for PhD. So I applied for quite a few different ones, mostly focused on fish and evolution. And I got offered one which I sort of worked out. Both me and my supervisor developed it, looking at the Loricariidae catfishes and kind of looking at their evolution, especially regarding sort of their dietary morphology. So that's like jaws, their mouth, how they feed. So it's kind of very similar. A lot of people study the African cichlids, and I'm studying it in catfish almost.
Yeah.
It's my favorite group of fish.
It's really fascinating. I mean, I don't think there's probably not a very popular favorite group of fish for people. People are going to gravitate towards, more colorful things. And I definitely want to get into the catfish more because I find that interesting. As far as when you're doing the biosystematics work, like, I'm somebody who likes things to be categorized and clean and in different groups. And when you start looking at evolution and you realize how messy things are and how difficult it is to group things together and create species and whatnot. So when you're doing that work, how did you feel? Like, are you someone who lumps species? Are you someone who splits species based off of genetic information, or is it morphology for you, or is that just not even a question that can be asked?
I like morphology personally.
Okay.
I find it a lot easier to work with. Both have their flaws. Both can have. So a lot of people always gravitate towards more molecular work. So think it's more reliable, but it does cause issues as well because one gene, for example, can have an entire different or infer a different tree or family tree phylogeny to another gene. Then you've got the mitochondria versus the actual nuclear DNA giving different sort of inferring another tree. So morphology does have similar flaws as in like, is that trait actually due to the similar niche, a similar aspect of the animal, or is it phylogenetic? And I think there's a lot to learn actually looking at the anatomy, and there's not as many people studying it anymore either. So there's a lot of paleontologists and they're studying something a bit more similar to that. But I do like with splitting and lumping, like depends what it is. So when it comes to like the catfishes, the ones people know as bristlenoses and citrus, I did one of my master's projects on them. They are definitely one I would split up, but there isn't enough species described. It's a really messy genus. It's just the amount that aren't described that is causing the issues, I think, and very bad old descriptions. So when you go looking through literature, what is in the description is the species. There might not be a type, which is a specimen that species is based against, or it might be a really bad type, like something that's half decayed or not reliable for that species. And then that genus is around 50 species, I think. The only issue is that like it's so diverse, like morphologically, and even molecularly, it's a big subfamily, big genus. Sorry.
Yeah.
And it just deserves splitting up. And they have different chromosomal numbers, so different karyotypes. Not a lot of people say they're the same genus, so they can hybridize. Probably not. So Ancistrus, I've got quite a few different ones in here, and there's no way they're going to be able to hybridize. Just on size, they range from anywhere like I think 5 centimeters to 30 centimeters, depending on the species. But then there's other sort of Loricariidae and catfishes I would probably lump together. A lot of the Hypancistrus that aren't described, I'd shove a lot of them together. And it's kind of like a lot of people, different ones have different values as well, and especially when there's not anything really strong to say they're any different, when it's just some vague patterning like L175. I think L173 cost, I think at one point £199 for a squiggly line.
Wow.
But that could be, it's different from Hypancistrus zebra, which here is around 100, 120, depends where you go. In Australia, that fish is a lot more.
Right. It's way more rare, harder to get. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's dealing, with Hypancistrus zebra, it's dealing with captive bred, but most aren't.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, it is. You realize it can never be a black and white scenario when you're trying to do taxonomy. It's always going to be blending and things like that. Well, so the message that you had sent me on Instagram was in some ways for me surprising, because I'm not I used to keep cichlids. I haven't kept fish in a long time. And I always look to the aquarium hobby because I always see these beautiful tanks and I see people that are really dedicated to, like, the one thing that the aquarium hobby does better than the reptile hobby is there's always an expectation of investment at the beginning. Nobody gets into fish keeping thinking that they can keep their fish in a Tupperware container and that's it. So everybody knows that you're buying a filter, you're buying a tank, you're probably buying lights, you're going to buy some decor. So there's that. But I always thought that they were, a lot of aquarium keepers and fish keepers were doing a great job. And the comment that you had made to me, and I'll get you to expand on that, is that quite often fish keeping gets sugar-coated and it often looks like it's doing a better job than it actually is. So maybe you could run with that and then we'll kind of pick this apart a little bit.
So, there's so many different methods of fish keeping. The first one I'd say is bare bottom tanks. So that is no substrate, maybe a bit of decor, maybe some plants attached to decor. So that one it's likely to get a lot of hate. It's a little bit more complex, I think, than that, and it depends on the fish you're dealing with. So substrate might have a benefit, might not. But that one, I think, it often lacks a lot of enrichment for the fish, especially when we talk about stingrays, which are potentially some of the most intelligent fishes. They're not having any interaction with any substrate, a lack of decor, a lack of any sort of landscape. And there's quite a lot of even big YouTubers, which I've seen, that do have these very sparse tanks, might not be bare bottom, but it doesn't offer any enrichment, no different surfaces, nowhere to hide, even for some very complex fishes, such as Mabu puffers, which can get to like a meter or more.
A meter? Wow.
Yeah, that's the upper limits, but they're quite complex fish. They travel a lot, so they're found even in Lake Malawi and up into, I guess, sort of more north, outer side of the Rift Valley. And they're just constantly rummaging, but you see them in aquariums where they're just sat there staring into space.
Like sitting on the bottom almost, yeah.
Yeah. And pufferfish, I don't rank that highly. I think they're highly food motivated and that's all that's really going on there. But they still need that space and that enrichment. The other aspect, I think, is also when it comes to planted aquariums. And you see the same, I don't keep marine anymore, I've worked with marine, but I think a lot of it is where people are focusing on keeping the plants or keeping corals, and they're not really thinking about the fish particularly. I guess because it's a lot of people aim for an aquarium as a decoration, they're often looking more at the plants or the corals and thinking about their care rather than the fishes themselves and prioritizing the plants. And just because a tank has plants, it doesn't mean that it's actually looking at the fish and keeping the fish. A lot of them, they might be keeping fish that don't benefit from that kind of sort of landscape or parameters, particularly when it comes to CO2. CO2 is quite it's a little bit more like complex, and I think it gets credit for because it is a toxic chemical or toxic compound if it's too high. And in addition to that, think about surface movement. Fish do need oxygen, and if a tank is very stagnant, are they going to be able to get that as well? And there is sort of discussion that you don't want too much surface movement for CO2 because it will diffuse out of the tank faster. A lot of it is just the hiding places. I think a lot of people, when it comes to sort of the fishes and the hiding places they need or the actual decor, they don't want to do that because it messes up the sort of landscape or the aesthetic. And sometimes fishes get a bad reputation where they don't need it as well. For like people almost get angry at the fish because it's digging up the plants, which is what it will naturally do. Another aspect I think with that has to be fertilization. Fertilizing plants is adding nutrients into the tank, and it's making it a little bit, I guess there's a lot more complexity because fishes will interact with those minerals too, especially like calcium. Fishes do get a lot of calcium from the water. And I think it is a lot of that prioritizing the plants or corals over the actual fishes and their welfare, or even choosing the right fishes. So it's really difficult. Like, it's because in aquariums we're looking at like the equivalent in reptiles would be you're controlling the gases in the air in the actual vivarium, but in the aquarium we're dealing with loads of different parameters and more than we can actually test for. A big aspect is that I've worked in the trade and so many people don't actually understand what any of those parameters are. So pH is not really important, but it interacts with a lot of the other ones. Even nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, and the toxicity of the different ones. And there's so much we don't actually know as well, particularly around nitrates. And nitrates, the literature largely focuses on, well, firstly, aquaculture. You're not keeping in aquaculture, you want to eat the fish, you're not going to keep it for more than you have to. And nitrites, we know, are heavily toxic. They cause or they bind with the blood, make it more difficult to take up oxygen. And plants, when it comes to that sort of thing, a lot of people will put in or emphasize that they're happy to have a lot of nitrates because the plants will use it. And a lot of the test kits, I think, are also quite vague. So, but I think part of it is like there's a lot of misunderstanding of fish in general, and actually like understanding how the complexity, the number of species. People will use the word breed for different species, use the word sort of like variety, or even saying different genera, different families, which sometimes is easy to mistake. And also mixing up different groups. So somehow Loricariidae are no longer catfishes because they have that plating, but they are catfishes. A big thing, I think, is a lot of freshwater fish that aren't living as long as they're meant to.
Right.
So a lot of freshwater fish can live a long time, and I don't see that. A big one is with the Loricariidae. I know that a lot of them can. So the Plecos, not that really any of them are out. They can live decades, some of them. So the most people I know who are reasonably knowing about them have 15, 20, 30-year-old fish. And then I've heard of an 80-year-old panac.
Wow.
And they're not even reaching, like a lot of people, their fish aren't even reaching 3 years. And for some of these fish, they mature about 5. So they're not reaching maturity. And it's not just the catfishes, because they can live exceptionally long lifespans, but cichlids, they're not living as long. There's a lot of myths about how long fishes live. So websites. So I had a 12 and a 21-year-old Panacus Macus, which is a clown pleco. And then you got websites that say they live for 3 years, and like, no. If you just look at the biology of different animals, you kind of get an estimate of how long they live. I think mammals are just a bit more shorter than you'd expect when it comes to like rodents and stuff. But there's so many myths about how long fishes live, especially people saying that some fishes only live a year. There are short-lived fish, so Nothobranchius, some of them only live a few months to a year. Depends on the temperature as well. And the size fish get to, there's so many stunted fishes. I see it most of the Loricariidae. So the gold nugget pleco, that is a fish that grows to around, well, in captivity, most people, I think the maximum would be about 10 centimeters. They can get theirs too. And in the wild, they're 30 centimeters or more.
Wow.
And they're big fish, and you could tell because a lot of them don't have that mature coloration, and they have been bred in captivity, but very rarely. And there's so many different things with fish keeping, because we're dealing with so many different species in a very sort of complex setup. It's a little bit difficult really, because there's so many different styles of setups. But a lot of people say, oh, it's captive bred, and therefore it's adaptable. Firstly, where is it being bred? So a lot of a lot of fish are bred in sort of soft water areas, so they haven't adapted to the hard water out of gay taps. And then also a lot of fish are wild caught and people don't even know. So clown loaches are a big one people think are farmed. They're not. I believe in 2019 around 1 million were caught from the wild or something.
Wow, that is
and these
crazy.
are fish that won't breed in your home aquarium because firstly they get to about 30 centimeters. They're social, people keep them on their own. And
yeah, people don't realize how big they get, like, because you see them in like the Walmart fish tanks or like the Petland, and they're like a couple of centimeters long. And then when you see somebody with a huge tank that's had them for a long time, you're like, wow, look how huge those are.
Yeah, and there's much nicer, smaller species. There's smaller species for everything. Yes, they might cost a little bit more, like Pangasius. Yeah, the fact that people eat them shows they're not a small fish. There's some smaller catfishes that look exactly the same. I think they look nicer. But it is finding them sometimes, and it is about the demand. There's an awful demand for the same species constantly, clown loaches being one, and species have been driven close to the edge for that demand, that addiction just for that one individual thing. So red-tailed black shark is one. I can't remember the scientific name, but that one, everyone, like so many customers would come up to me and say, I need one for my tank. Every tank has one. I'm like, firstly, in the wild, they're shoaling, but they're so nasty to each other that you do need a big tank and a good size shoal. And it did bring that species to the brink. And that sort of aspect where everyone's focusing on individual species is so much of an issue. Whereas I think it would be better if people just diversified a bit, because we are dealing a lot with wild caught, and because some species have never been bred in captivity or really difficult to, or if you totally made it only captive bred, you'd skyrocket the prices given how difficult they are to maintain. And there's so many benefits for the individual communities out in Brazil, particularly Peru, from that. And I think a lot of farmed fish, I'm seeing so many different health issues, from bent spines, weird shaped eyes, small hybrids are common. So you'll think you're getting one thing, especially like synodontis and African cichlids, and you're actually getting a mixture of God knows what. And therefore you don't know their adult size. So it's so much of a big issue. There's so many different things, but there are good communities out there, especially when it comes to specialized setups.
Well, it almost kind of goes back to the original, like what we were talking about at the very beginning, is aesthetics. Like when we were over focused on aesthetics of a particular fish that looks a certain way, or the plants or the coral, it can really lead you astray, and you're not actually focusing on what the animals require. But then there's also, and we see the same thing in the reptile world, because one of the things you said to me before is that you actually appraised the reptile world for seemingly advancing, which I was like, oh, well, yeah, we are trying to do that. But I'm surprised that someone from the fish world was thinking that, considering I thought they were ahead. But one of the criticisms that we get on the side of pushing people to think about things more complexly is that it becomes too much of a barrier to entry for the new people, right? Like if it's a new fish keeper coming in, it's so complicated. So like that's the hard part, right? Where you have this mind of understanding how the system should work and how what fish interact with each other, what decor they should use, the chemistry of the water. But you also have a PhD, or you're getting a PhD, like what do we do with like the 12-year-old who's just trying to get into it? Like, do you think there's a way to trickle the scientific literature down to a point where someone can actually use it without being too complicated? Or do you think this type of hobby is reserved for people who are willing to accept a complicated problem?
I think part of it is a complicated problem, and we can't avoid that. There so many species, and we're controlling everything about it. A lot of the thing with fish keeping is I find that it feels like it's very difficult to find anything past that sort of not even intermediate level. There's very few resources that go past that, other than ones that just list species and their care. So it's really difficult to actually find anything that is more, I guess, where you're looking at, you've got really interest in fish and you're trying to look a bit further, because that's what I find. I end up only looking at the literature now because there's not as much else out there. And there could be more resources, I think, that make it more accessible. There's a lot of unreliable resources that will label science and they're not scientific at all. And it's really difficult, especially for young people starting out. I don't think it should be a barrier to entry, but I think it should be emphasized that there is a lot more to it. It's not like, because I guess a lot of resources are at that basic level as well, and they don't say there's a little bit more to it than that you'll eventually maybe go down. And it depends what fish you're keeping. Some fish you can stay at that sort of level and not need to know that much, especially when you're dealing with one species. Then if you want to deal with others, you'll have to start learning scientific names, especially like cichlids, the Loricariidae, anything like that, because it's also an international hobby. Not everyone uses the same sort of terminology, the same common names, really. So it does get a lot more complex when you're dealing with more than one species. I don't think it should be about, I think people are stubborn as well when it comes to actually having to learn more than just what gets them along for without actually doing any better.
Well, even something as simple as like the lifespans, for example, if people were selling those fish with and saying this fish could live like 25 years, that itself is kind of like if you read that, you might go, oh wow, I'm really gonna have to understand what I'm getting into before doing this. And so it's to say it lives for 2 or 3 years, people think of that as like, oh, that's actually not very complicated, it's not a complex thing, I can easily jump into this, and in a couple of years, if I don't want the fish anymore, it will be dead anyway and we can move on. And we see the same thing in the reptile world. This gecko is going to live 8 years. Well, actually it could live 40 years. We have no idea because we don't know some of the lifespans for some of these animals. And so there's that kind of, again, that balance between like the commerce side of brands and stores trying to sell and get people into keeping, and then there's people who are like, well, let's pump the brakes here, like let's talk about the scientific literature and how do we trickle this down. It's definitely complicated.
And it's dealing with complicated animals, and I think like at some point everyone has to ask it, because we have animal rights people breathing down our necks. Like reptiles have it worse than we do, but who's gonna we don't know who's gonna next ask. Like there was an interview with PETA and that went terribly wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the other side where they can pick, cherry pick bad things that are happening on the keeping side, and it becomes very difficult to say like, oh, these people don't know what they're doing. As far as you go, looking at literature, how do you go about acquiring information? Obviously, you probably have access to a university database, so you have easy access to peer-reviewed papers, and fortunately, I do as well. I work at a university, but not a lot of people do. But just for yourself, what do you do to expand your knowledge?
So I usually, first I do own quite a few different books as well. Just because sometimes old techniques, I think there's so much value in those old techniques, or like things that people did once, knew once, and no one really repeats again. So that's a big one for me. And especially when I'm getting new species, I might flick through some of them. Or I'll start looking online. There's especially when I started keeping discus, for example, because I never really had them before. I looked at what websites I knew were reliable. Practical Fish Keeping is brilliant, and I have 70 plus issues of the magazine lying around, so I store them or hoard them in a massive pile. They have a website which has amazing resources. It doesn't reference, which does annoy me because I like to know where information is coming from, but a lot of their authors are well respected, well known throughout the hobby and in science as well. So I look at that, and there's other sort of websites like Seriously Fish, and that's where I kind of get a little basic sort of knowledge of it. And then I always think about key terms for Google searches, And I depends on the topic, but I might totally exclude aquarium websites because there's so much unreliable information, and that's for research in general. So if I have something that I'm like, everyone says this, or I'm asked a question, I'm like, I'm not sure, I'm going to double check, then I'll totally ignore aquarium websites because there's so much information that is just copied, no citation, and you don't know where it's from and how reliable it is. So like I've been researching KH's carbonate hardness, which is a parameter that people rave on about. I never really did, because it's meant to interact with pH and crash it. If the KH is low, which is so carbonate hardness, carbonates, so a lot of people measure RO, so water by that, which is like pure water, and then remineralizing it. And I just, for questioning it, I was like, I'll see what's around, what everyone else says that the aquarium hobby doesn't. So ResearchGate is useful if you don't have access to institutional access.
Right.
And I use a lot of key terms. So I just use the name of the thing. If it's like a species, then the scientific name, because more reliable sources are going to use that scientific name because it's universal. And then I'll just use the word journal after everything, because most journals are journal of something. So it should bring it up on Google. And then if not, I'll go through ResearchGate, Google Scholar. And a big thing I think is, especially if it's a controversial topic, I'll always look at the methods of the paper. And that's a big one I think a lot of people maybe don't do, because it is really boring looking at the methods. But it shows how applicable it is to what we're actually doing. So for species description, no real point looking at the methods. But if it's anything relating to the hobby, I think it's really important. So a big one for me at the moment is looking at plants in the aquarium and the interactions, because it is, I've been through so many different papers on the thing. It's a lot bigger, more complex topic. But I have noticed that I've seen people also cite papers and not read the abstract. And it totally disagreed with what they said. And I'm like, the abstract is the thing that you're meant to be basing your citation, like, it's the main thing. But I always make sure you read the methods as well as the results. And maybe, so I think that there needs to be a lot more critical analysis. It's a difficult skill in a way, and avoiding confirmation bias. There's so much. Is what you're reading agreeing with what you're saying? And if it's agreeing, are the methods good? What about if it disagrees? Are the methods okay? How are those results, like, really think about how they're reading the results. How are you reading the results as well? Because I think that is one of the biggest things, is there's not enough critical analysis of anything in the hobby. Anything, like a big one that I saw, not that I really know, because I really am not, like, with diseases, I'm not a pathologist, so I try to avoid it a little bit. But epistylis is a disease that everyone was like, if your fish has spots on it, it's got this disease. And I was like, you know what? I've been asked a question on it. I was like, the literature says something entirely different. This disease does not display with spots. And then you go down, and I saw why people said it had spots, because of a certain website. And I was like, oh, great. And then, and just linking different papers. And most authors, I think, if you email them, they're happy to send their paper over.
Yes, yeah. Well, those are some really good points, especially for anybody who's just trying to expand their knowledge on whatever species they're working with. You can dig out a lot of information that's actually on the web. But you're right. If there's a lot of sort of what I call telephone game information that goes along, where somebody has a piece of information and they share it with somebody else, and you never get back to the original source. And every time it gets shared, it gets changed slightly different. So, by the time 5 years goes by, that piece of information is not only doesn't have a scientific association with it, it's also just morphed into its own thing, and people just assume that's right. So, and it can be challenging to read scientific information that goes against what you believe, because it's hard to absorb that and implement it into what you're doing. So I think those are great tips. I really wanted to talk to you about, because this is where the two worlds of reptile keeping and fish keeping are similar, as far as ecosystems / communities in the fish world, and bioactivity in the reptile world, where people are trying to create these complex systems, and quite often it's more just kind of like you had said, people are adding plants just to make them because they like the plants, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a natural ecosystem. But I don't even know if that's a bad thing. Like, is it bad that you add plants that aren't from that natural area? I mean, again, it's kind of a balance. So as far as people trying to create ecosystems and communities in the fish world, what are you seeing?
So the first one I see a lot, and I'll have to remember to get back to the rest of it, is a lot of people label it as natural. The fact there's plants, and freshwater ecosystems are very complex. There's so much diversity, even in just lakes or rivers, different sort of nutrients and different sort of flow regimes. And a lot of them aren't what people think they are, especially when it comes to plants. A lot of them don't have that sort of dense planting, unless maybe, depends on the ecosystem, but especially if you're dealing with anything sort of higher up in elevation, there's not enough nutrients, there's too much flow, there's nowhere for the actual plants to root. And there might be more algae, maybe some bryophytes, which are plants, but they're not traditional plants. And it just gets this one sort of style of planted tank gets labelled as natural when it's not. It's nothing like nature, and I think it is a misunderstanding of freshwater. Like with marine, a lot of people think of marine and think coral reef, and then get angry when their fish eats the coral, or like isn't from a reef at all. But so, like, I don't think there's any actual issue entirely with plants themselves. But I think also it depends on how you make that setup. And also, like, a lot of the time, if you're focusing on the plants, are you focusing on the fish? I lost my trail of thought on one thing. But, like, there's this whole emphasis that you need plants for a stable tank. And I don't think that's true, given that, well, firstly, freshwater ecosystems largely aren't relying on the plants for that nutrient circulation. Maybe some very closed lakes are, but they tend to be quite harsh for fish. Then you get lakes which are maybe more planted, but you don't really see many fish in them, because for various reasons there might be more invertebrates, for example, or amphibians, where there is that interaction between the terrestrial environment and not. But I think there's when they're labelled as natural and the only way you're going to have a stable aquarium, it's really not looking at what freshwater is and the diversity of freshwater and the benefits of having something maybe a bit more close to what the animal has in the wild. So plants themselves, it's really just the parameters for caring for them. So other than like fertilization, the other one is where people are treating it like this natural ecosystem, which it's not. And half it, I wonder whether people going and looking at the local river where people have dumped fish in, dumped plants, it's heavily polluted by sewage and waste. And then they're like, oh, that's what my lake looks like, because it's covered in plants that aren't meant to be there. It's eutrophic, so covered in algae. Even like here, there's streams that were once like just rocks, and now they're covered in silt and algae. But I think the issue comes where people are not water changing, they're not changing, the waste isn't getting turned over. And yes, plants might do some of it, but there's a paper, I was reading on it, that said that you actually firstly definitely do need to remove that plant waste to actually, like the plants decaying, stuff like that, to get out the waste. And then it's a lot more complex. So floating plants, for example, there's a paper or papers to suggest that they actually take oxygen from the aquatic environment, especially as they clog it up. And it is so much more of a complex issue. There's issues with if you're not water changing, there's so many parameters you can't test for. Those plants are using up minerals. And it is the same sort of thing as bioactive. People are thinking that, firstly, they think it's the easy route, maybe, that you don't need to do any maintenance. But is everything getting turned over? Is there that full ecosystem that half of it we can't even see? And with the terrestrial environment, I guess there is that much more like local sort of turnover, but it is so much on a larger scale. When it comes to invertebrates, how many different invertebrates are there? With freshwater, though, we've got this whole turnover of water. So even the lake is shoving water in, shoving water out. And I think that's the big one with planted aquariums being labelled as natural, really, because that's the popular topic. And it, like, since Wolsted's method, which is a book, it's really expensive, so I haven't actually bought it, but it's got so many flaws to the actual method, and it's so much more complex. And I did say in one video once that you do need a thesis, like to do a PhD on just this individual topic. A lot of it is based on aquaculture. The fish aren't meant to live long because you're going to eat them. Right. And then also they're trying to avoid pollution because farms of any kind produce pollution that then goes into natural waterways. But it is so much more of a complex issue that I think you can't test for it all. And people are crashing their tanks just, I guess, in the attempt to try something that...
Well, and I think that's the thing is, like what you had mentioned, is people add greenery and it looks natural because green always looks natural. You know, that's just part of our nature, is like seeing plants. It seems natural. And then you fall into the trap of thinking that since it's a natural ecosystem type thing, I can do less maintenance or less water changes or less cleaning on the reptile side, just let things go. It's not necessarily the case. There's, of course, maybe the fish and the reptiles are getting some benefit of enrichment and whatnot from the plants or something to interact with. But if you're sacrificing your own maintenance and cleaning, then you're kind of fooling yourself into thinking that this is an all-natural situation for this animal, where maybe you are decreasing the oxygen levels in there and actually having some plant decay material and actually making the environment much worse for it. But to our eye, we're like, oh, there's some green in there, so it must be good. Yeah.
And also, like, so many fishes, I think, don't come from that sort of habitat, and there's so much that benefit that could come from doing what we call biotopes. So something actually like what is in nature for them. So whether it be leaf litter for some, where they come from areas of high tannins, or something about replicating their natural habitat, which is an art in itself. People that do biotopes do heavy amount of research, and there's different levels of it. Like, if you want a strict biotope, you couldn't use, like, say, oak leaves as leaf litter. You'd have to use from that region. Right. And there is a misunderstanding, I think, always, that they think one river, the Amazon, is the same. Like, so many people will say South America is black water, so full of tannins, it's quite turbid water. And it's like, no, because there's clear waters and there's white water. There's a whole mixture of different habitats, even within the same portion of a river. Hence why the Rio Xingu, where zebraplex come from, hypercistrus zebra, that's very high flow in most areas, but there are areas, even within the same patch, where there's very low flow, and there's fishes that prefer that sort of habitat, but if you stuck it in a high flow, it's not going to be happy.
Right. So do you think that it's vital that as much of the natural habitat of each species is brought into their captive environment? Because there'll be people that would maybe say, like, let's just imagine that plants aren't going to cause any parameter issues with anything, and that, you'd already mentioned something like stingrays, where it'd be kind of cruel to not give them something to interact with. Would it be better to give them something to interact with that's not natural from their area than to not give them something to interact with at all, if that makes sense?
I think it's fine. Like, to have that something to interact with, because the plants themselves aren't an issue. It's just that focus on plants. I think there's so much value in different decor as well. Like most of the fish I have come from areas that maybe are more rocky, but I think wood also is a lot easier to create crevices with. And then even artificial decor. For half of the catfishes, we all use clay sort of caves. Some of them prefer it, not all do. But I think there's so much value in different decor or providing a variety, but I don't think plants are something we have to rely on. Especially when it's some of the plants, like if you're going to have a deep sand bed or something, that adds another level of complexity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that is really fascinating. And yeah, it's more about falling into the trap of thinking that this is a whole natural experience and then kind of forgetting the other pieces. So let's I can't believe we've already been talking for an hour. It's flown by. I want to touch on your PhD work before we completely wrap up. So tell me, you obviously you're focusing on the catfishes, and was it
Loricariidae? There is. It's a long word. They're all long words and all difficult to pronounce.
Yeah, all these Latin terms.
No one really cares how anyone pronounces something because everyone uses different. Yeah.
Well, why don't you tell me a little bit what you're focusing on as far as the focus of the PhD project? And I know it was diet, and also seemed like it was morphology related with the mouth and how that's evolved over time.
Yeah, so it's very similar to sort of a lot of cichlid research, looking at how their evolution of that dietary morphology elements of whether it is based on evolution or whether it's influenced by the actual diet. Because so many species, they might be able to specialize. They might be able to specialize, but they can also generalize. So like you see it, like I guess a lot of snakes, they might specialize, but then we're able to feed them all sorts of in captivity, which shows that there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to that sort of element. And with many fishes, it's similar. And it depends on the actual sort of genus, especially, or genera of fish and animal, because there is a hypothesis that generally fishes are a little bit more generalized in their diet or morphology. So I'm looking also at how they feed. I think that's particularly interesting, at looking at how they feed on different surfaces, how they're able to work out different prey, or even algae or detritus. Depends on what they eat, because not many are actually carnivores. But like, for example, there's a few genera that are specialized in mollusks, and they're actually able to, well, from what it looks like as like personal observation, that they're able to actually extract the snail from inside of the shell, opposed to maybe crushing the shell, which others might use, and how that differs. And also that sort of phylogenetic influence on it, because those examples of carnivores are a little bit more sparse.
Right.
And I think it's particularly interesting when it comes to, because when we think of herbivory, everyone stuffs it all together, and there's so much more diversity. A lot of these aren't really eating plants, like strict plants. It's more algae and different organisms, and seeing how it's just interesting to see how they might differ, maybe whether it's like sort of when you look at sheep versus goats versus horses, how they feed on that similar resource and select different parts of it. And there's not much research into the topic. It's mostly focused on their phylogenetics, because there's and their sort of taxonomy, because there's 1,040 species.
Wow, that's crazy.
In this genus, which you can get quite a few in the hobby. Like not all of them. There's some restrictions. Like Brazil is always a bit hit and miss depending what you're after, and some just access to them, because maybe Colombia, sometimes that is a little bit more difficult to get.
Can you say some of the common names that people might know in the aquarium hobby that are kind of underneath this umbrella?
So the big one is Pleco. That one, so that I would say just covers the whole lot.
Is Pleco a genus or?
Pleco was a genus, so it was Plecostomus.
Yeah.
It no longer is. It was split up into multiple different genera. So it did include Hypostomus plecostomus that we don't see in the trade anymore. I think that's a Suriname species, and which is why we can't get it so easily. So it doesn't exist anymore. And then that common name has been used for Pteroplecthes, which is what everyone sees in what's it, Petco, PetSmart, says it will be labelled as Hypostomus plecostomus. It's not. That has never been in Plecostomus. And then we've got bristlenoses, that's Dancistrus. They were in Plecostomus, but people get really iffy about calling them Plecos, and like they're more of a Pleco than Pteroplecthes. We've got zebra Pleco, sunshine Pleco. We've got whiptails, which is mostly focused on another subfamily. So Loricariidae has several subfamilies. The most of the ones you see in traditionally think of as Pleco is Hypostominae, which is the largest. Loricariidae is another large one, and that's the whiptails. So they're the elongate ones. There might be some that feed or live especially in the substrate, so in sand or silts. Then there's others that feed maybe on the surface. And there's a whole diversity of different diets even in those sort of habitats. And then the smallest ones are, well, Ottocinclus is one of the genera within Hypopotominae. So they're sort of the more social, I guess. Most of them are miniature, but they're evolving towards that sort of miniature size. But I did find one species which was, I think, 15 centimeters.
Wow.
Ottocinclus won't get that big. They're brilliant. There's so many different colors of different species and genera. Ottocinclus is amazing. But the problem is we don't, common names, we don't really use too many. And they get the same species might have multiple common names.
Right.
And different species might have the same common name, even from different genera. So snowball pleco is a big one because it's used for Hypancistrus, well, several different Hypancistrus. People get iffy about which ones, but it's just they get around anywhere from the 6 centimeters to 12 centimeter species. They're spotted, solid black, white spots, and then they're also under that common name is the larger Biosystematics L142, so an undescribed species, and that gets over 30 centimeters. So if you just use common names, you don't know which size you're getting and which diet.
Right. Well, that's the thing too. When you're dealing with 1,000 species, you can't. Yeah. Common names are no good.
And so much of the diets you see online aren't maybe correct as well.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that was the one thing that I think when we were talking back and forth on Instagram was just this concept of wood eaters. Maybe just run with that.
So Xylobori is meant to be wood eating. There's it's quite, because there's not any fish I think that are actually true xylobores. So when people see the gut analysis of Panaclus, so this is the royal pleco. Panaclus has multiple common names for different species, and also Hypostomus cotyledon, which is a group, also known as, I'm going to say rusty plecos, but it's probably not. But that's quite a few different ones. There's Basilisco, Chimera, and then potentially Elassie and Sistra. So these all are totally different. It's all convergent evolution, but they have wood in their gut. So people assume they're eating wood. And so there was a paper in 2009 that had, it said that, yes, they're ingesting that wood, but the fish are losing weight when only fed the wood. So this was a study just on Panac, which is one of the largest genera in size, because the smallest species I think is 30 centimeters. The largest grows over 60 centimeters.
Okay, wow.
And that's excluding the tail, because we measure fish without the tail. And then so that paper came out. I assume every paper's been ignored, I think, by everyone. But then there's a 2012 paper that used isotope analysis. And then there's also a 2021 paper that used more bacterial analysis, so look at the bacteria. So they can't digest the words. They don't use it for digestion because they don't need it for digestion. They have 2 pairs of jaws, like cichlids, so they're not going to need wood for that. And what they're actually digesting is very different. So they're digesting the fungi within the wood and the bacteria. And I think a lot of aquariums, it's not going to be that easy to grow, especially if you're ever treating anything. You might have to introduce the actual sort of different species of bacteria, of the fungi. And I think also the types of wood that we're using are very sort of solid, hard woods.
They're not decaying in the water. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
and
basically,
they're dried out beforehand.
Right, exactly. So they're eating the wood, but that's the vehicle to get whatever's growing on the wood, whether it's fungus or algae or microbes or whatever.
Yeah, and not all are found around wood. So I think there's one species found in the Rio Zingu which doesn't really have much wood. So they're able to eat other things. They're just focused on eating, or they're adapted to get their food in a different place that other fish can't.
Right.
They've got very strong jaws, and even within those different genera, they can get into different levels of the wood. So Panac, the largest, can get really deep into the wood, whereas the other, the smallest Panaculus, which they used to be thought of this as the same, they get about anywhere from 5 to 15 centimeters. They go a bit more surface level, and I think even within that one genus, there's different. And it's just trophic partitioning, which I think is as interesting as if they did eat wood.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing what evolution can pop up with to say, like, we have all this different, like a buffet of different types of food, and each of these fish are going to have a slightly different morphology in order to access those different sections of the wood to get whatever it is that they're trying to get. So what is their jaw shaped like, or how are their teeth positioned in a way that gets them to pull wood off?
So, I've got one actually. You
got a jar.
Yeah, I'm going to have to put gloves on because I only took it out of the formalin recently.
Okay.
It's alcohol, so I'm a bit.
So if anyone's listening on the audio version, you'll have to come to the YouTube version. I'll make sure it's timestamped so you can come see Rebecca pull a fish out of a jar. It's a deceased fish.
Yeah, so this is the blue-eyed Panac from Colombia, I think, and it was given to me. It died, I think, on import, which is what I get quite often. Is where quite a few of them. Yeah, usually I'm not too fussed about wearing gloves, but you can kind of see. This is the sort of mouth area. Oh, and you've got the teeth here. They're quite large. Most of them are like hair-like teeth.
Yeah.
And I've got plenty of photos and videos on Instagram and YouTube of different like jaws, but they got sort of round.
Interesting. So are those teeth are they pointing to each other like this in a way?
Yeah, so the bottom ones are that V shape, and the top is sort of like a bit more of a U, I guess.
Yeah, angled down a little bit. Okay, that makes sense.
But sort of like if we compare to, so this is a dried specimen. This is really badly mummified because this is Pteroptychs josemanus. Oh.
Yeah, okay, I see
and
that.
You see that's a lot more hair-like.
Yes, yeah.
You see the jaw's a little bit better because it's shrunk a bit, but
yeah. Well, that's pretty fascinating, though. It's amazing that what evolution can do in order to give you a set of jaws that can rip wood off like that at that angle too, which is kind of a weird angle to eat.
They're quite mobile as well at the bottom, but different species have different jaws. I've got this is Leprocanthus here. This is one that. It was preserved in acetone, which doesn't actually preserve well. So I kind of ended up drying it out. But this one has a lot more. This is a carnivore.
Okay.
So it's got very slim. It's really difficult to see, but it's got that sort of very mobile.
Yeah, okay, we can see that. Yeah.
So it's ripping into sort of the snails. But the thing is that a lot of the detritivores, the alcivores have much more teeth than the carnivores.
Right. So what about any of those, ready-made diet like wafers, algae wafers, and things along those lines? Is that okay to feed these fish, or because I imagine a lot of people are just putting their wood in their aquarium and feeling like that's fine because they're probably watching their fish actually eat the wood. Whether or not it's getting anything is the question. So with supplement diets, as far as those go, is that okay?
It depends. So most of them, like they say algae wafers, and they contain next to no algae, which is a big one for me. That especially like there's no real like diet that has fungi in it. So for Panac and Panaculus, the wood eaters, then getting like putting mushrooms in if they eat it. I've got Panaculus in there and they won't touch it. But trying to get some sort of fungi in. The issue is that a lot of what they're eating might be difficult to get as an ingredient.
Right.
So the closest I would say is getting a diversity of algae, I think, nutritionally. Vegetables, I think, are going to be a lot more poor quality in terms of a diversity of vitamins, minerals, amino acids. And they tend to be a bit more high protein than a lot of the vegetables that people feed.
Right.
So I always look at ingredients. I totally ignore percentages anyway, because I think it's very vague to look at just protein percentage. But a lot of them don't contain hardly any algae. They might contain a lot of fish milk. These fish don't eat fish naturally. They might once an occasion happen to have some fish, but I never see it on the gut analysis. That's the best we have, I think, at the moment for actually like knowing what they eat, even though it's really vague. So only Panax we have, and that group, the wood eaters, we have a really detailed diet of.
Right.
But I never see fish. And the issue is with fish is they're not actually able to access as much of the nutrients from it. So there's a paper, it was published, I think, 2021, that it was an introduction. So there'd be plenty of other papers on the topic, inferring that they can't actually access the calcium and the phosphorus from fish meal if they're not a piscivore, so a fish eater.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah, so it ends up being a lot of these, we can kind of get away with it because the fish can sort of handle it, and it's cheap.
Yeah. And there's always a lot of the same sort of cheap ingredients, cereals. These fish don't eat grain. Well, some might have had grain in their gut analysis I've seen, but whether they're actually digesting it, whether it's fallen into whether it's gone into what they're feeding and it goes through.
Yeah.
And a lot of vegetables that they're not going to be eating anything similar, especially like potatoes, peas, something like that. And it's based on like, it's very good stuff if you're wanting to eat the fish. It's based on aquaculture. And many people have noted it, like in journals, that a lot of fish feeds are based on you're going to eat the fish in it hopefully as soon as possible, but maybe a year, I guess.
Yeah. That's a very interesting added aspect of fish keeping, is that you have a whole set of scientific information that's completely directed towards aquaculture, which is farming.
Even like the water changes and the plants, a lot of that is aimed at aquaculture, and totally different group of species. So it's like basing a tortoise's diet on a snake's diet.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Because they're totally unrelated, or they don't even look the same half the time.
They just happen to live in water.
Yeah, and a lot of diets, they might be different brands. They contain that same sort of set of ingredients, and you'll see loads of different claims on the bottle, like this is natural, etc. Has loads of algae. Half of them don't have loads of algae. Carnivore ones with grain in, and like a lot of carnivore things. Most fish aren't, like most of the fish we keep aren't eating other fish. And yes, there's insect meals, but it'd be nice to have a diversity of different invertebrates that they have able to access. And I think another issue with that is that insects are high in chitin, and some are really bad for it. So I've seen like mealworm meals and stuff like that, and cricket meals, crickets aren't too bad looking at the data on nutrition, but mealworms and earthworms, I think live earthworms are different, but it's a lot more complex, I think. And a lot of brands are making all sorts of, there's not much that is actually directed at an individual type of diet. It's all very bored.
Yeah, and there's nothing really stopping the brands from just kind of doing whatever they want
No.
because, like I said, because the fish can get away with it, and or because the
People
keepers can
buy
get away
it
with
as
it. Yeah,
well.
people buy it. Yeah, it looks simple. It's it's a ready-made food, and so yeah, that is fascinating, and it's interesting listening to you talk because you're coming at this from a very scientific point of view, and I can imagine how frustrated you get with the hobbies that you're involved in because you're like, why are we doing it this way? And there's a lot of myths and a lot of things that are just perpetuated over time because it's how we've always done things when there's actually nothing scientific about what we're doing.
And there's a lot of just misleading resources that just say something out of the blue because they can, and people take that for gospel.
Yeah.
Especially because if you use the word science, even for brands or products, people take that as they know it's actually scientific, but it might not be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and it seems like one thing that you're doing is with your YouTube channel, you're trying to bring some of that information down to maybe the more everyday person. So maybe we can wrap up. You can just let us know what's on your YouTube channel and what kind of people or what people can expect when they head to it.
So I'm mostly just focusing on science of fish keeping, different aspects of the biology of the fishes, mostly focusing on the fishes I keep. I think it's really important to talk about what I know and what I actually specialize in rather than kind of doing a bit of a guesswork. I always I try and provide references as well, should people want to look further, and just really discussing fishes in general, different aspects of their biology, I think, adding another aspect to learning about fish and making people, I think it's really important, like, don't just trust what I say. Here's a topic that you can look at further.
Yeah.
But I think that's really important, just to look at.
Well, and who knows?
Question everything.
Exactly, and who knows what other people will end up going to find, right? Like, you can't scour all the possible data that's out there. So if you encourage people to go do that, they might find some information that you haven't found before and bring it to you. And that's kind of that's what I love your channel. It's very reminiscent of the channels that are trying to push the reptile keeping forward as well as, trying to not necessarily make the flashy video, but talk about the science and talk about where things are and what we can do better. So that is fascinating. Well, Rebecca, I had a blast chatting with you today. This was fascinating. I love kind of getting into different topics, and I think there's so much parallels between reptile keeping and fish keeping. And I think just listening to you speak about how you gather information and how you process, how you step into keeping fish is so helpful for people, even if they don't keep fish, although many people listening to this podcast will keep fish because there's such an overlap, but you can still pull so much over to reptile keeping as well. Can you let everybody know the name of your YouTube channel and then your Instagram page as well so they can come find you?
Yeah, so my YouTube is Freshwater Ichthyology. Spelling it is you'll have to look it up, I guess. Ichthyology being the study of fish. And my Instagram, I've got the Freshwater Ichthyology one, which is for the YouTube. I have got, I think it's Rebecca Francis 97, which is my personal Instagram that has a lot of the scientific specimens, because there's a lot of sort of things with actually posting specimens from museums where it can't be used, anything connected with like YouTube or anything, I don't think.
Right.
Saves a little hassle.
Yeah. So if you want to see the specimens,
personal one that is just
awesome.
Mostly specimens, but it means I can post other things like guinea pigs or whatever, or the snake.
Awesome. Well, that I'm sure people will head there. I'll make sure all that's in the show notes as well, and I'll have the ichthyology spelling for people so they don't have to mess around with it. They can press the button and take them right there. So, Rebecca, thank you so much. Good luck with the rest of your PhD, and we'll continue to watch your channel. And thank you so much for coming on the show and bringing this information. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
All right, that is the end of that episode. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Like I said at the end, you were a blast to chat with. You can tell there's so much information in your head, and it was great to hear you just kind of rattle that off so easily. Like I said in the intro, it's just fascinating to talk to somebody who's so involved in one particular part of science that you just become this incredible expert. And I know you're still working on your PhD, but I think I would consider you an expert at this point. And it was really great to hear the differences between both worlds and kind of how both worlds overlap, and understanding how to use scientific literature and how to avoid those myth pitfalls, as well as the pitfalls of thinking that just because something looks natural that it's good for the animal. And anyway, I got a lot out of that podcast, and I know that the listeners will I know the listeners will have as well. Tongue twister. Listeners, thank you so much for listening. If you did enjoy it, make sure you share it on social media. If you want to leave a comment, you can come over to the YouTube version and leave a comment on the video. I always try to get back to those, most of them, as much as I can. If you are looking for me on Instagram, you can find me at Instagram at animalsathomeca. The show notes for this episode are found at animalsathome.network.com. You can join us on Patreon over at patreon.com/animalsathome. If you do become a patron at any level, you automatically will be entered into the Discord server, and you can talk with the other listeners, and there's always amazing things going on in those conversations, and of course, I'm in there as well. Thank you to Custom Reptile Habitats for sponsoring the podcast, and that brings us to the end of this episode. I will see you guys next week.